Welcome to the StrongTeams.com podcast, where we help leaders build strong teams. Teams built on empathy, understanding, and trust, where every team member feels valued and contributes at the highest level possible.
Welcome to the StrongTeams.com podcast. My name is Steve Neesmith.
And I'm Rodney Cox.
And Rodney, our guest today, is Dave Travis. Dave has advised large church pastors for over 30 years, facilitating focused conversations that drive change and action. 23 of those years were spent with Leadership Network, where he retired as the CEO in 2018. Since then, Dave has worked with dozens of churches and their leaders, helping guide them to solve sticky challenges through his new role as Director of Strategic Counsel to pastors and church boards with the firm Generis. And if that wasn't enough, Dave has also published 11 books. Dave, thank you for joining us today on the StrongTeams.com podcast.
Thank you, Stephen and Rodney. Now, to be honest, I've published 11 books, and as I always say, dozens sold, half dozens read.
That's great. That's great.
Appreciate the honesty there, Dave.
Absolutely, Dave. We know exactly how that feels. So, listen, let me add my welcome to Dave. We're grateful that you're here, and our paths cross all the time because we serve the same audience, but you and I've never met face to face. And so I'm grateful to meet you today. I'm glad that you're going to be on our podcast. And once again, I think that our listeners will be excited to hear what you have to say about transition and helping pastors transition well. So listen, Dave, tell our listeners a little bit about yourself personally. Let's start kind of with your family and your background.
Sure. So I was blessed to grow up in a godly family. Grew up outside of Atlanta, Georgia, in a suburb called Smyrna. When I was 9 years old, I asked my dad about what it meant to be a Christian, and I was led to Christ by my dad, sitting on our back deck in Smyrna, Georgia. I grew up wanting to be like, my parents and like my father, and I actually wanted to be an engineer like my dad. I went to Georgia Tech. That's where I met my wife. I'll tell you more about my career after that. But my wife and I have been married now since 1985. We have two adult daughters. One is married. One will be married later this year. And so that's kind of our family. We live outside of Atlanta, Georgia, still on the other side of town, on the east side of Atlanta now.
Yeah, so I was married in 84, so I beat you by 1 year, right? So we're rocking on that 40-year mark, right? It's right around the corner.
Exactly.
Absolutely. So tell us a little bit about your your professional journey. How did you join up with Leadership Network, and how did you get connected to Generis?
So right after I graduated from college at Georgia Tech, there was a small church outside of Atlanta that needed a summer youth guy for the summer. And I didn't have anything to do for that summer after graduation. And I went to a small church in DeKalb County, Georgia, called the First Baptist Church of Lithonia. 39 years later, I'm still there. I'm not the summer youth guy. I'm just a layperson there at that church. But things went well. That church encouraged me to go to seminary, which I did, and stayed there. I eventually became what in our tribal tradition is called the associational missionary, and I did that for 8 years. And a friend of mine, a mentor, a man named Lyle Schaller, connected me with Leadership Network in 1992, and in 1995, they had me join their team. I was a peon. I was the junior program guy. Eventually, I did become the CEO in 2011, as you already mentioned. But, this issue of succession and leadership transition was very important when I joined in 1995. I was able to be mentored by people like Peter Drucker, Jim Collins. We began having lots of conversations about succession with various pastors and churches around the country. I helped build some workshops and other convenings. And when I turned 55, I said, Lord, I've been leading an organization for a long time. And I'd really like to get hands-on with churches again and really help them. And so I began to advise our board at Leadership Network that this was my intention. And over time, we worked out a succession plan, or at least a way for me to exit. And so that's where my friends at Generis called me up and said, "Hey, what do you want to do in your next season of life?" And I said, "Well, I really want to help churches in the area of succession." They said, "Well, why don't you do it with us?" Of course, Generis is mainly known as a generosity initiative place. And I love that about our organization, but I only focus on succession issues and issues that deal with the board and the pastor.
So talk a little bit more about when you use the word succession or transition of senior leaders. What does that really mean? Help our audience understand what you really mean by those terms so we don't make any assumptions.
Absolutely. So succession is the intentional transfer of power, leadership, and authority from one primary leader to the next primary leader. Most of the cases that I work on, 90% of my consulting work, are with churches that have long-term leveraged leaders. In other words, those leaders, everything is different about the organization since they came. These aren't leaders that have only been there a few years. These are leaders often that have 20, 30. My longest serving pastor I worked with was 53 years at the same church. Now that's rare. Don't see as much of that, of course. So I work with those long-term leaders to help them and their church plan for what I call ministry momentum multiplied. I've been very fortunate to design and work with churches where they've built momentum during this season and accelerated out of the succession and the handoff season so that the next leader has a great shot at being successful in the next season.
And how does temperament deal with that? We come into a lot of churches that have gone through transition, and you had one senior leader that has a certain temperament, maybe is more of a planner and really methodical, and and you get another leader that comes in that's more of an optimist and a vision caster, and not quite as detail oriented, and it kind of creates that a real kind of emotional jerk for the not only the staff but the congregation. Do you see that often?
I've been fortunate that I haven't. I've seen it in other places though. So part of my process begins with the current leader. What I say is there's three pieces of this process. There's the leader's future, which is what do you do with what's his name? The current leader. What are we going to do with that person? And do they have a role here in the future or not? And what does that look like? And how do we send them off well? The second piece is what's the future leader need to look like? And a lot of people want to start there, and that's the wrong place to start. My guess is, Rodney, that what you just described is when people started with, well, let's find the next future leader. And there's three main components, I think, in the future leader piece that churches need to consider. Number one is what's our seamless story? Not as what does seamless transition look like, but what's our storyline that needs to carry forward for the next chapter of our story? Doesn't have to be a forever chapter, but what's that next chapter need to look like? And then we use that to help build our profile of what the leader needs to look like and what the leader needs to focus on for the next chapter. Then we go find the leader. And then we onboard them well. Third component, onboarding on-ramp. We onboard them well so that they understand this is where we as an organization, as a church, are going. This is where we think God is taking us. How would you help us get there? Now, you ask a good question, and that is sometimes we have to build staff around that new leader. But that needs to be a part of our process. We need to understand that going in. When we don't understand that going in and we just assume that the current leader will be like good old what's his name, that's when we get in trouble.
Yeah, sounds like a beautiful process. I'm very, very thorough, and I think that churches that endeavor to cover those bases and make sure that that transition is happening well is so important. And when we don't, we can hurt a lot of people along the way. So I'm grateful for what you guys do in that plan to keep unity and oneness and harmony inside the body of Christ. I think unity is really close to God's heart, and sometimes we don't see a lot of unity post-transition. So that's great. Thank you.
David, Generis, you like to use the term smart succession to describe your approach. Can you explain that term to our audience and why it's important? You might have covered a little bit of that with your previous comments.
Yeah, I did cover a little of it, but I felt I needed something that rhymed. So I needed two S's. All good Baptists, have to have something that kind of rhymes together. So I just chose smart because the opposite was just dumb or stupid. And I'd seen plenty of stupid succession, and that rhymes too. So I said, we need to figure out the smartest way we can do this. And so that's when I began designing these, tools and processes that help people to do this. When I first joined Leadership Network in 1995, my colleague, Brad Smith, said, succession is the brown paper bag issue. It's the thing they want mailed to them in an envelope so no one knows what the pastor is talking about. Because they were afraid that if they raised these issues, that they'd get fired. What are you talking about leaving? Now it's a very key issue. Most people realize that that we've normalized the conversation, that this is a very natural thing. For a healthy, growing church, we need to have a good plan for this. And so here again, when I say smart succession, it's just a name I put to the tools and process pieces that I use to help guide the church through this kind of thinking and planning and hopefully good execution.
Well, we're glad to hear that it's become more mainstream to talk about these things in a more open public setting. When people think of leadership succession planning, Dave, they may think it's only for the mega churches or the universities, the Christian universities. Do you agree? I mean, what does your client list look like generally? Or is this type of planning important for all faith-based organizations, big and small?
Well, number one, I do think it's important for all faith-based organizations, no matter the size. My specialty and my experience is predominantly with very large churches. So let me just be very transparent there. I've never done a university. I've never done a Christian nonprofit per se in that sense. I think it's more important the longer the leader is there. So the longer that leader has been there, the more important the succession plan is or should be. I grew up in and was serving a group of churches that were smaller churches, and many of them changed pastors every 4 or 5 years, whether they needed to or not, in some ways. And the planning doesn't have to be as explicit in those cases. And you know what? Everybody knew what to do once the pastor had resigned. But when you've had a pastor that's been there 20 and 30 years, now we have a different challenge. You would be shocked. I'm currently working with 8 churches in an active engagement. And half of those churches, when I first said, let me see your governing documents, half of them had no mention of pastoral vacancy or succession. There was no guidance in their governing documents. Now, these were very smart churches and smart people, and they just figured, well, we'll figure it out if it ever happens. Or maybe Jesus will come by then. I don't know what the thinking was, but we need to think about these processes clearly. People, especially in churches, and I think one of the differences between churches and nonprofits is in churches, people really do identify with their pastor, especially a long-term pastor. That becomes their pastor. I'm a part of Pastor Rodney's church. That's how they identify themselves in their walk with God. And so because of that strong allegiance and identity, we need to have a good plan put in place. I have worked with a church as small as 350 that had a long-term pastor. Here again, long-term pastor. And everything had changed about that church since that person had been there. but most of my clients would be very large churches.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. You use the word clarity, and so that we can see things clearly. And it's a great segue into my next question. And it talks about blind spots for a minute. What do you think the biggest blind spot is that you typically see in a church or any ministry that you're working with as they try and work through senior leadership retirement or, leaders moving on, succession?
Yeah. So the first blind spot, I'd say there's three. Not starting soon enough. Okay, and so there's a phase that could be even 5 or 10 years before that there's some things that should be done or could be done and can be done. I usually get in with the church in between 36 and 24 months before a handoff. So it's the importance of starting early, not waiting too late. The second thing is starting at the wrong place, and I already mentioned this one. Is you start with the current leader or the leader's future. What do you do with what's his name before you get to the future leader? So leader's future, then future leader. And so if you don't start with the current leader, you get ahead of the process, and there are things that are unresolved, and you say, well, we'll figure that out. And that's the bad place to start. The final one I will say is what most churches miss is a good onboarding on-ramp. Especially even if they hire an internal person to be the next leader, they basically say, all right, preacher, it's all yours now. Have at it. And there's not good process for onboarding that person to this church, this culture, this seat on the bus. So those are the three big kinds of pieces that I see churches have blind spots in. They figure, well, that leader will know what to do when they get here. And it's true. A lot of leaders come in, they know what they want to do, but it may not fit this church or where we are or this staff team. And we have to be better at onboarding those people well.
I appreciate that answer. Rodney and I have talked about onboarding on the show in the past. Honestly, Rodney, I think we could talk about it again, probably do multiple episodes on the importance of onboarding, because it is such a blind spot for leaders in every organization, especially ministries. It doesn't even have to be a major senior leader transition, and onboarding is important at every level. And it's a great way to love your staff, if you will, is to have a thought out onboarding program, even for bringing in that new front desk receptionist out there in the church. They are lost without proper onboarding. And so I'm glad that was one of your key points there.
Yeah, and for us, just like you kind of have a niche in succession, our niche tends to be in relationship building. We think that the greatest thing that a leader could possess is relational capital, that there's really no greater thing that they could possess. And so the amount of relationship that they have, the love that pastors and their staffs have for one another will cover a multitude of sin, right? When we step in the wrong buckets, when we unintentionally harm each other or hurt each other, it's our love for one another, our relational capital that's going to see us through. And so talk just a moment about relational capital in transition and succession, if you don't mind.
Sure. So I always say that the speed that we can move is dependent on two things. One is the speed of trust, which is all tied to relational capital. And the other thing is the speed of decision making. So what is the pace usually that we make big decisions here at our church? And that's also tied to relational capital. The only other work I do besides succession is in building better boards. And there's three components to that, of which the base is what's the relational connection between the board members? How strong are those relationships? And that really does determine the speed, the pace, the strength, I think, of all boards. And so to your end, Rodney, a core component of any great process, whether it's succession or building better boards, is how strong are our relationship ties. It doesn't say necessarily we have to like everybody all the time, but there has to be enough respect and predictability to those relationships where we know how we can move forward together.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Strong relational capital and bonds will see us through. Give us one example of a client. Don't mention their name, please, but that has just like really impressed you and how they've executed during their leadership transition, and kind of what you think set them apart.
Yeah, so I've been very fortunate. Of the 46 or 47 churches that I've gotten through the process, 46 have gone really well. Okay. And I think here again, designing what to do with old what's his name, the former leader. And in, about 2/3 of the cases that I work with, especially founders or near founders, that person will stay in some role at the church. Can be part-time role, can be a full-time role, but they will stay in some role into the next chapter. Now, I usually encourage these churches, give that person a sabbatical where they're in no contact with the church for a year or 6 months, 8 months. And we put guardrails around that and referees around that. So I have a client that had a founding pastor of 43 years. We designed what would happen with he and his wife who wanted to remain in the community and they wanted to still attend the church. The board had set up an agreement with that pastor before I got there for some financial encouragement after retirement, but he wanted to still be involved in some way. But we did design really good process around what his role would be, how he would not have an office at the church, but what he and the new pastor, how they would relate and those kind of things. He would not be an elder anymore. It worked really well. They've done really well over the last several years. I'm very proud of them. I think the second thing is having a great profile of the kind of leader we're seeking. And I mentioned that earlier about how we develop those tools to build the great profile of the leader this church needs for its next chapter. Okay, and making it very clear what we are seeking. And a part of that is, how do we clarify the directions of this church? What are the core directions that we are not going to change or we don't think should change? And if we can identify those along with the rails that should not be touched, at least in the next chapter, we need to have those clarified among the board and leadership so that we know, nope, this is set, but all this other stuff we could change. I'd say the other thing that has really set apart those that have done external searches, and I have nothing against search firms, but most of my clients of large churches don't use search firms. Those who've done really well there have gotten after it on getting referrals for their leader. And they do that often by building a really good, attractive profile and making sure that gets into the hands of as many people as possible. Not just one or two of the right people, as many people as possible to say, hey, who do you know that could fit this profile? We'd like to talk to them.
That's so interesting. Dave, I thought it might have been just the opposite, that you would have said that search firms were the key, but it makes a lot of sense after listening to you that, back to something we talk about so much on this podcast is that relationships matter. And when you take those relationships in the church and leverage them and out into the community, whether that be locally, regionally, or nationally, you find the best people. I'm glad you went there. I thought it might have been a different answer than that.
Yeah, if the senior pastor or senior leader is a lifelong learner, there's all kinds of networks they're a part of, and they probably have, even in their mind's eye, somebody that might be able to fill those shoes. I think that's a very, very interesting strategy and tactic. So, let's talk about building strong teams for a moment. So we've made this succession. We're making the transition. We're onboarding this new senior leader. What do you do, or how do you help this new senior leader build a strong team? What does that look like during the onboarding process and in that first year after you've onboarded?
So let me answer two ways. So the first way is the current leader. Before we get there, how do you build a strong team that moves into this? Because I think that helps predict the momentum coming out of this. So for the term I use, and it's borrowed from an old friend, he says the first thing that the old leader needs to do as they move into this is grub the stumps. And that means, is there anybody on the team that may be great? They're just great people. And they've been loyal to that current senior pastor. Maybe they've served for a long time, but the pastor knows this person is not going to make it under the next era. So the appropriate thing first is to provide an honorable way for that person to leave with dignity and with generosity, and to help them get to their next kingdom assignment. So I think that's one of the things that a lot of people miss is sometimes they'll say, well, I know old what's his name is not going to be that good for the next leader, but I'm going to let him deal with it, or I'm going to let her deal with it. And I think that's one way to, pack their backpack too heavy for the next season. The second thing is to prep everybody that this thing runs in phases. William Bridges wrote a book called Transitions, where he says there's three major phases to any transition. You have to have healthy endings, productive neutral zones to get to good new beginnings. And part of the process that we use is to help people experience all of those phases before they can get to a good new beginning. Now let's go to the next leader. You mentioned specifically, how do you help the next leader as they're moving forward, right? I think one of the key things, and I'm sure you guys have some tools for this, I call it the manual of me, or the leader's operating manual. And it's really a conversation tool between two people that says, this is how I like feedback. This is how I like to lead people. This is what I expect. And both leaders, share. There's about 20 questions in there. And it's really a basis of a conversation between people at the top levels to describe how they work best, where they work best, where their strengths are, and how they can work with each other. They need to, a staff member needs to say, I've been doing this for years and I kind of hate it. Or they need to say, when I'm working in this area, this is when I'm at my best. Now, we can't always accommodate every request or everything, but it gives a new leader a place to work any new plans or any new initiatives to certain team members' strengths and not to their weaknesses.
Yeah, the power of conversation, right? The power of conversations and driving purposeful conversations, and not just, hey, let's have a cup of coffee together. Let's have a process, and let's have some purposeful questions and purposeful conversation about how shall we now live together, because that's going to be really important to our success in executing what God's called us to do. And so beautiful. We would ascribe to that. We have a three-legged stool as well. It's very similar to that, right? And first is, what does God's word say about our differences, right? We're different people serving together. We have different gifts, skills, talents, abilities, and so on. What does God say about our differences? Well, what he says is, what you have, I don't have. What I have, you don't have. And when those two come together, we have more. But we have to lean into that. We have to be purposeful about discussing that so it doesn't create conflict and frustration and all those other things that can drive out of that. And once we've understand what God's word says, then what we need to do is have some objective data. So our little 8 to 10 minute questionnaire gives objective data, produces a 22-page word picture on your God-given strengths, how you problem solve, how you process information, manage change, and face rules set by others, right? Because you're going to have to navigate those every day that you're working together. And now that we have that objective data, let's have some purposeful conversations. And so our third leg of our stool is purposeful exercises around that objective information. And for us, that it's right up the alley of what you just spoke about, purposeful conversations. And very, very few people know how to truly have purposeful conversation, especially in the onboarding process or in that first year of or first 6 months of working together. And it can get really messy if we're not purposeful.
Very much agree. Yeah. And I always tell folks, especially new pastors, hey, look, you need to have these conversations with the board, with your direct reports, and maybe even one layer down from that. just so you can understand who's in the system, how can we work together. And yes, you do need to have some all-in conversations where you're thinking about the future and you say, well, I know these are the core directions we've set. How can we get there together? What's my role here to do that? Too many pastors have bought into the idea that if I just come and cast vision and preach to it, it'll happen. And like, nope, you need to back up and you need to just schedule a bunch of one-on-ones. And I always encourage folks as well, not just with the folks in your system, but also with some strategic outsiders in the community, so you can learn more about that community.
Absolutely, and key volunteers, all of those matrix to build that relational capital is so important. Dave, as we close our time together, I'm sure there's something I missed. So, what is it today that I did not ask you that you wished I would have asked you, and that would be a true encouragement for the leaders listening here today?
Sure. So, during the COVID season, I dealt with a lot of pastors who, man, they were done emotionally. And even today, there are folks that don't see their churches, quote, coming back like they want. And I think the first thing is recognize that the COVID comeback means we have a totally different opportunity, and we're going to have to think about this in new ways. I don't know what that means for all the clients that you serve or that I serve, but I know that some of the ways we were thinking pre-COVID are not going to work post-COVID. And we have to examine those carefully and move forward strategically on those. I would say that we all know bad examples, and we all know unique examples when it comes to succession. And many people try and follow someone's unique example that fit their church. It's another mistake that a lot of people made is we want to do it just like, and then they fill in the name of their favorite pastor that they observed to do it. I'm like, well, and usually I know the case because I've known, megachurch pastors for a long time. And I'm like, yeah, what he didn't tell you in the book was this, they not only had one internal candidate, they actually had two. And, here's what they had that you don't have here. And so recognize that your place is going to be different and you need to customize something that fits your church. I think the encouragement is we're getting a lot better at this. Like I said, I had 40 of contracted clients that have gotten through the process. 46 of 47 have gone real well. One was a total disaster. Okay. And that was a father-son. One that you would think would have had high likelihood, but they ignored some key principles along the way saying, well, we love each other, and that's never going to happen to us. And then it happened. Exactly. So the encouragement I have is there's lots of good stories out there. There's more good stories than bad stories.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Dave, tell our listeners where they can find you. How can they? I know that you've got a new book coming out here in the fall. I'd like you to talk about that just for a moment. And how can our listeners find you online or connect with you?
Sure. So, a couple things. Churchleaderinsider.substack.com is my weekly newsletter, co-written with a couple of folks. You can go there, subscribe for free. I'm on LinkedIn. That's kind of the primary way I connect with a lot of people now. If you tell me that you heard me on the Strong Teams podcast, I will accept your request. Also, Generis.com/Dave-Travis, or just Google my name and it should come up. Finally, if you want a copy of the free book, 33 Basic Statements About Succession, send me an email, dave.travis@generis.com. It'll also be on all those other pages I mentioned. And I'll put you on the list. If you're U.S. based, I will ship you a copy of the new book that's coming out this fall. 4-color, highly attractive. It's all about basic things that every church needs to know about succession.
Well, our guest today has been Dave Travis. Dave, we're grateful for you being on our show today. I know that you're a busy man, and our listeners, I'm sure, will enjoy everything that you've had to say. I think there's a lot of nuggets of wisdom there. I hope they take you up on your offer for the free book as well. Once again, Dave is the Director of Strategic Counsel to pastors and churches and other boards at Generis. And Dave, we once again want to thank you for your time.
Thank you, Rodney. Thank you, Stephen.
Until we meet again, God bless.